Hey guys, welcome back to another YouTube video of us. Today, we're gonna dive deep into our online coaching process. And our process of online coaching, if we get a new client, is by starting it with an assessment, a fundamental assessment. It's called FRA, Functional Range Assessment. It's from the FRS systems. And with this assessment, we're gonna assess not only movement quality first, so this is just a car's observation with the quality of the cars and the quantity of the cars. And the second step is always active-passive ratios of the joint. So guys, let's look at her internal rotation first. Hip internal rotation or shoulder internal rotation in general, except the spine, is the most important and fundamental function of the hip in terms of a healthy and good functioning hip. Okay, so we first assess and look at the hip internal rotation, for example. So in this case, we would usually do it on the ground or on the table as a table test. But for you, so you see it better, we are here on this box. So she has a yoga block in between her knees. She is gonna slightly press her knees against it, and we're first gonna look at her active range of motion of both hip internal rotation on both hips.
Same time?
Same time, just same time, exactly. So she's pressing out, so that's her max internal rotation. And if we're gonna look from the front, we actually see that they're quite similar, quite good, but around, let's say, 45 degrees, right? Yeah, 45 degrees. Okay, so let's take one of her hips into passive internal rotation, okay? So same test, but this time no muscle engagement. I'm gonna pull her into her passive end range. And I'm gonna also say, before we start obviously, that she should always give me a sign if she's feeling discomfort or pain, okay? So I'm gonna take her into passive end range. Nice, okay. So I feel a block right here, right? Also, always important to look at your client or one of our clients if we do that. And especially in this case, it's not that dramatic or harder to see, but actually there's an importance of, is this really true hip internal rotation, or is your pelvis also shifting to the side to give you or to fake more internal rotation of your hip? So if that happens, obviously I could push her more, but then she really tilts to the side, so that's not true hip internal rotation. So we would stop right before that, okay? So after seeing both passive and active, let's check the other side quickly. Maybe there are some differences here. Looking at her pelvis again, if the pelvis shifts or not. So both hips are quite similar. So with these findings now on her hip internal rotation, most important stuff is what are her goals, right? So what are her goals? What is her lifestyle? What should her hip be able to do or express in order to be or perform good in her life, in her daily life, and also in the sports that she loves? So for example, if she has a 9-to-5 job, always sitting, for example, and only wants to move good, running 2 to 3 times a week, and do a normal gym workout, her internal rotation, active and passive, are good. We should not be like, or there's no reason to push her into more range of motion because she doesn't need it, right? So Heels and Rails, for example, a lot of passive stretching to open up even more the hip would not necessarily be necessary, right? So if her active range of motion would be here, for example, and her passive is here, then there would be a huge gap, obviously, between active and passive ratios, right? So what does it tell us? If we find 5 degrees or 10 degrees of active hip internal rotation and 45 or 50 passive, then we should start to close that gap with maybe some passive range holds, some passive range lift-offs to first close that gap, because this gap between, let's say, 5 and 10 degrees and 40 degrees passive are way too much, and this is just it's not usable range of motion, so you cannot use it. And especially if it comes to injuries, she has a higher potential to injure herself right in these ranges of motion, because she cannot actively go and use this range of motion. So the injury potential is much higher, and therefore we first have to close that gap before we try to force her and to open the hip up more, okay? So it's a very, very important to understand for some of you that it's not just, oh, we give you a program, or oh, you're gonna be our next client and we just give you a general program. We really assess each joint individually to see, okay, where are you at, where you wanna be, and how is your lifestyle, right? So another example is, the reverse example would be if we see that internal rotation actively and her passive this way, it would be like no good idea to give her even more passive range of motion and to just stretch for long durations, long time, because then the gap increases even more and the injury potential and the non-usable range of motion in between that will increase, right?
So and then we have the third case where you have both passive and active range of motion is very small. So if I'm going into active range of motion, and then I'm like, okay, this is active, and passive is maybe here, then you obviously want to work on your passive range of motion using pails and rails, going through long duration stretches while simultaneously strengthening that range of motion as well. So then you have more work to do because you want to get both better at passive and active. The good thing is that when you go through pails and rails and then perform some kind of lift-offs afterwards, you're strengthening both, or you're getting both more passive and more active range of motion simultaneously.
So guys, another very important aspect after we talked about different kind of options depending on what we see and what we assess on different hips, for example. If we have the case of her current active mobility and passive mobility, which are quite similar, both 45 degrees, and we're happy with what we have, then we can look at other stuff as well. Of course, for example, linear functions, so straight leg hip flexion or hip extension. So if we already know her internal rotation, her capsule is functioning already quite good and quite well, and we have sufficient range of motion in rotation, then it's also time and maybe also necessary for, depending on her goals, for example, to work on linear function. So always remember, rotation first. If her rotation would be very restricted, then we have to work on external and internal rotation first before we start working on linear function, so straight leg hip flexion or extension first. So that's very important. So we just not leave the hip as it is because we're happy with internal rotation, right? There's a lot more work that can be done, right? So even though her hip internal rotation is fine, we can still work on more range of motion depending on her goals or on linear stuff. Okay.
Or on strengthening the range of motion that you have even more.
Exactly. So that's always a good point, and also necessary, because if you think about our central nervous system and our body in general, it's very smart, and the energy conservation of our body is very, very important, and it always decreases strength or flexibility if we don't use it on a daily basis or on a regular basis, not on a daily basis, but on a regular basis. So going back to that internal rotation from time to time, even though you now have sufficient active and passive range of motion, is very important as well. Okay, guys? So you already see there's a lot of things coming together when we assess people. Therefore, it's not just a program you will get, it's a deep fundamental coaching where not only you get an individualized program, but also an individualized coaching. So guys, I hope you like this little insight of how we start with our coaching process. Usually it starts with an assessment, FRA assessment, which is so important, and even I think the most important part of the coaching, because without knowing what we have in front of us, it doesn't make sense to throw exercises to people and thinking of why can't they do this exercise, or why are they so weak, right? So it's very important to have this assessment, and we hope you liked it. Leave a like or subscribe to our channel. If you have questions or something was unclear, please write it in the comment section below. We're happy to answer. And guys, if you want to dive deeper and get your own individualized coaching and program, use the link in the description below to schedule a free call with her or me. We're happy to see you there, guys. See you next time.